Good morning. Welcome to Iron Sharpens Iron. My name is Jeremy Nettles. I am the evangelist for the River Ridge Church of Christ that meets in Newburgh, Indiana at 5600 Van Road. We would love to have you join us for our 9 a.m. Bible study every Sunday morning and our 10 a.m. worship period following that. We also have an afternoon worship period that begins at 4 if that is more convenient for you. Of course, we encourage you to join us for either or both of those opportunities. I also encourage you to get in touch with us if you have comments or questions or requests for a topic for us to discuss on this program. You can get in touch by phone at 812-550-6234 or send an email to info@riverridgechurch.org. We would love to hear from you and get back to you as soon as we can. Those are also good ways to sign up to receive our weekly bulletin in the mail if that is something that interests you. There's a new article every Sunday, and those also appear on our website if you would prefer to just log on that way and find them at riverridgechurch.org instead. You can also sign up for our correspondence course if you'd like to join in that. It's just a 6-part series in which we send you material back and forth, and it asks you some questions and directs you to a handful of passages in this book to help you understand better what are God's basic expectations of each individual, and then the hope is that we can progress a bit further from there. So if you would like either of those, the correspondence course or the weekly bulletin, then just get in touch, give us your name and your address, of course, and let us know which of them you are interested to receive, and we'll put you on the list and start sending them out. We also encourage you to check out our weekly radio show every Sunday afternoon at 2. You can find that on 98.5 FM as well as 1400 AM. And our YouTube channel is youtube.com/River Ridge Church of Christ. We encourage you to check that out and subscribe to it, and you can see all of the past TV programs, so there's a great opportunity to catch up on something that you missed or to revisit something that you've been perhaps thinking about and wanted to go over in some more detail. It's also a good way to follow along with our worship services because we live stream all of them. A month ago on this program, we went through the very early chapters of Genesis, from basically creation to the earliest glimpse of Abraham. And we talked about what God was doing during those ages, so to speak, and more importantly, what he saw fit to preserve and pass down for our consumption and benefit and understanding of his design. And we saw a pattern through those ages that God would put in place some kind of a system, some kind of a design, and then he would sit back and watch as mankind messed it up. After which he would choose one man around whom to construct a greater manifestation of his eternal plan and start over. And so this happens with Adam, in a sense, although that's the first installment. And it also happens with Seth, we could say, after the Adam and Eve have been expelled from the Garden of Eden, and Cain and Abel have destroyed the status quo coming out of the garden. It also happens with Noah, and then finally it's beginning to happen with Abraham, where we left off in chapter 12. And we talked some about how this was to be fulfilled eventually in Jesus, who is not just one in a long line of instances where this happened, but the one at whom all of the others were pointing. Today, let's pick up where we left off with Abraham, and then examine God's use of this man and his descendants in pursuit of that same goal. So let's start in Genesis chapter 12, beginning in verse 1. Now the Lord said to Abram, "Go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you, and I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great, so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and him who dishonors you I will curse, and in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed." A brief note on names before we continue. He's called Abram here in chapter 12, and that continues up until chapter 17, I believe. I'm probably going to continue to call him Abraham just because that's what I'm used to. God eventually changed his name, but it's confusing, so let's just call him Abraham. The same thing applies with Sarah, his wife. She's actually Sarai to begin with, but let's just call her Sarah. It simplifies things. Here we've got the origins of Abraham and his wife, and we also get a note about his age in verse 4. So Abram went as the Lord told him, and Lot went with him. Abram was 75 years old when he departed from Haran. 75-year-old man, and God is uprooting him from everything he's ever known and saying, "Follow me, I'm going to completely change your life." But it's going to come with some wonderful blessings. why did God choose this guy out of all those available? Well, if we read the rest of the chapter, then we still won't have an answer. We're left to speculate. There's a wide range of opinions as to exactly why God chose Abraham of all people, but really it comes down to God's inscrutable choice. You don't know why God chose him, and I don't know either, because he hasn't told us. But the fact remains that he did choose Abraham, and who are we to question that? We actually see a contrast. I mentioned in verse 4 that Lot went with him, that is Abraham's nephew, and we see a contrast in chapter 13 between Abraham and his nephew Lot. These two men have very different goals in their lives, different mindsets, different worldviews, we might say. We see a hint of this in chapter 13, beginning of verse 6. The land could not support both of them dwelling together, for their possessions were so great that they could not dwell together. And there was strife between the herdsmen of Abram's livestock and the herdsmen of Lot's livestock. And so Abraham proposed a solution. Despite the fact that he loves Lot, he is willing to be separated from Lot in order to better pursue the best interests of each camp, so to speak. We can see that solution in verses 8 and 9. Then Abram said to Lot, "Let there be no strife between you and me, between your herdsmen and my herdsmen, for we are kinsmen. Is not the whole land before you? Separate yourself from me. If you take the left hand, I will go to the right, or if you take the right hand, then I will go to the left." It's a difficult thing to do, but you can see why Abraham is willing to be separated from Lot. It's despite his love, but it's also because of his love for him. And you can see that it's not a selfish motivation on Abraham's part, because he gives first choice to Lot. He lets him pick. And what did Lot choose? Well, without reading it, Lot looked around and he saw the area that looked like it would be the best for his herds, and he said, "I'm going there." Despite being called righteous in 2 Peter chapter 2, verse 7, we can see that Lot does have a selfish motivation here. It's as if he's willing to compromise a bit with evil and recklessly endanger himself and his family from a spiritual perspective for the sake of a material advantage. And it's not as if Lot walked into this blind. Verse 12, Abram settled in the land of Canaan, while Lot settled among the cities of the valley and moved his tent as far as Sodom. Now the men of Sodom were wicked, great sinners against the Lord. The fact that it's mentioned right there suggests pretty strongly that Lot was aware of this, and yet he did it anyway. And even if he hadn't been aware, when he discovered what sort of people these were among whom he was now living, he didn't say, "Right, that's it, we're going back out into the wilderness." He stayed there. He seems to have stayed there for quite a long time. And how did it work out for him? Well, he ended up bereaved of his wife, and of all of his property, and of all of his material security. He ends up, for all intents and purposes, an impoverished hermit in the wilderness, committing incest with his daughters. You can read about that in chapter 19. Now, I'm sympathetic to Lot. He didn't, I don't think, set out to do evil. And he's not entirely responsible for his worst failures. Again, you read about that in chapter 19. Peter calls him a righteous man, but we can also see that he has enormous flaws. Lot ends up as a case study in the proverb, "The road to hell is paved with good intentions." He made a selfish, foolish choice seeking short-term material gain at the expense of spiritual growth and health and security. And he ended up losing his material possessions as well as his wife, while Abraham, who appeared to have gotten the short end of the stick when he and Lot went their separate ways, Abraham was blessed in every way, despite his own significant failures. This, for us, is a warning about having other gods before the Lord. It's also an encouragement to trust in God to take care of us when we love and serve Him. We're not quite ready to move on from Lot yet, because in chapter 14, Abraham demonstrates his continuing care for Lot as well as great boldness in rescuing him and his family and all of his neighbors from captivity. Lot and all of his household are taken captive. They're basically taken into slavery, but word comes to Abraham. And what does Abraham do? Well, he chases down these kings and fights a battle against them in order to rescue his nephew and all those grievous sinners. This is followed by an odd interlude in verses 17 through 20. And after his return from the defeat of Kedorlaomer and the kings who were with him, the king of Sodom went out to meet him at the valley of Shavet, that is, the king's valley. And Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought out bread and wine. He was priest of God Most High. And he blessed him and said, Blessed be Abram by God Most High, possessor of heaven and earth, and blessed be God Most High, who has delivered your enemies into your hand. So Abram gave him a tenth of everything. Why give to this unknown guy? Well, because he's priest of God Most High. He is he is a proxy for God. And beyond that, there are some New Testament implications. We can find this in Hebrews chapters 5 through 7. It's a foreshadowing of the Christ. I'd like to read chapter 7, verses 1 through 3. For this Melchizedek, king of Salem, priest of the Most High God, met Abraham returning from the slaughter of the kings and blessed him. And to him Abraham apportioned a tenth part of everything. He is first, by translation of his name, King of Righteousness, and then he is also King of Salem, that is, King of Peace. He is without father or mother or genealogy, having neither beginning of days nor end of life, but resembling the Son of God. He continues a priest forever. Now, it's not that Melchizedek is some otherworldly being, or that he is a pre-incarnate manifestation of Jesus or something, but textually he anticipates Christ in similar fashion to Adam and Noah and Abraham himself, because he is a priest, and we're not told why he's a priest. We're not told from whom he inherited this position or who appointed him to this position. He just shows up, and then we never hear about him again, apart from being briefly brought up again in Psalm 110, but that's a story for another day. In chapter 15, Abraham's covenant with God is sort of solidified and given more explicit terms, and there's a great focus on one promise, the promise of offspring. Chapter 15, verse 1. After these things the word of the Lord came to Abram in a vision. Fear not, Abram, I am your shield, your reward shall be very great. But Abram said, O Lord God, what will you give me, for I continue childless, and the heir of my house is Eliezer of Damascus. And Abram said, Behold, you have given me no offspring, and a member of my household will be my heir. And behold, the word of the Lord came to him, This man shall not be your heir, your very own son shall be your heir. And he brought him outside and said, Look toward heaven and number the stars, if you are able to number them. Then he said to him, So shall your offspring be. And he believed the Lord, and he counted it to him as righteousness. What was it that made Abraham so special? His faith. We see it manifested in his willingness to trust God when his predictions seemed very implausible or even impossible. Abraham is a very, very old man, and he's never yet fathered a son. And yet now God is saying, your very own son. But this gives rise to a problem. In chapter 16, we see an example of Abraham's imperfection. His wife, obviously frustrated about being an old woman and still not having children, despite God promising a child to her repeatedly, proposes a way of getting herself a baby. Let's use a sort of surrogate in my servant Hagar. Sleep with her. Father a child with her. And then I can raise that child as my own. This is, to put it bluntly, adultery in the supposed service of God's promises? Now, it made enough sense to Sarah and to Abraham that they went through with it, but when we put it in those terms, it's pretty obvious that it's not going to work. This is the approach that is brought about through human reasoning, whereas God's reasoning is, well, it's rather different. In chapter 17, verses 4 and 5, we finally get to the name change that I predicted earlier. Behold, my covenant is with you, and you shall be the father of a multitude of nations. No longer shall your name be called Abram, but your name shall be Abraham, for I have made you the father of a multitude of nations. That's what Abraham means, father of a multitude. This is 24 years since the promises from chapter 12. 24 years that God has been saying, I'm going to make of you a great nation. And more recently in chapter 16, he had said, your very own son will be your heir. And yet, after 24 years of being told this, he's not getting any younger, and his only offspring is this quasi-legitimate child, Ishmael. And in fact, Abraham himself brings that up in verse 18. And Abraham said to God, Oh, that Ishmael might live before you. This is a condensed way of saying, I've got a son right here. He should be my heir. You promised me a child. Here's a child. Isn't this good enough? But that's not what God had in mind. And God's response is in verse 19, "No, but Sarah your wife shall bear you a son, and you shall call his name Isaac. I will establish my covenant with him as an everlasting covenant for his offspring after him." This is picked up in chapter 21 with Isaac's birth. "The Lord visited Sarah as he had said, and the Lord did to Sarah as he had promised. And Sarah conceived and bore Abraham a son in his old age at the time of which God had spoken to him. Abraham called the name of his son who was born to him, whom Sarah bore him, Isaac. And Abraham circumcised his son Isaac when he was 8 days old, as God had commanded him. Abraham was 100 years old when his son Isaac was born to him. And Sarah said, 'God has made laughter for me. Everyone who hears will laugh over me.' And she said, 'Who would have said to Abraham that Sarah would nurse children? Yet I have borne him a son in his old age.'" The name Isaac in Hebrew sounds like "he laughs." When God told Abraham this back in chapter 17, verse 17, "Then Abraham fell on his face and laughed, and said to himself, Shall a child be born to a man who is 100 years old? Shall Sarah, who is 90 years old, bear a child?" Sarah also laughed, chapter 18, verse 12. So Sarah laughed to herself, saying, "After I am worn out and my Lord is old, shall I have pleasure?" So the very name by which they called their child, which, by the way, let's remind ourselves, was chosen by God and not Abraham or Sarah, that name serves as a reminder of their imperfect faith and of God's perfect faithfulness. But Sarah is able to redeem that and take it from a reminder of their sin and turn it into a reminder of joy, because it turns the scoffing into, well, an overflowing of happiness at the birth of this child of promise. Chapter 22, verse 1. "After these things God tested Abraham and said to him, 'Abraham,' and he said, 'Here I am.' He said, 'Take your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah, and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains of which I shall tell you.'" We've got questions here, and I'm sure Abraham does too, but he trusts God. And so he obeys. He takes Isaac and a couple of servants. He brings everything needed for the burnt offering, with the understanding that Isaac is the burnt offering. And yet, when he put Isaac on the altar and is ready to kill him, verse 12, the angel of the Lord said, "Do not lay your hand on the boy or do anything to him, for now I know that you fear God, seeing you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me." Now, of course, God never intended for him to actually go through with it. Partially, this was a means of distinguishing himself from all of the pagan idols, many of whose cults did demand human and especially child sacrifice. So it's a separation between that and what God actually wants, as well as what we saw there at the beginning of the chapter and here in verse 12 as well, a test of Abraham's faith, which I must say he passed with flying colors. We jump forward to chapter 26 and we move the focus to the next generation, to that son of promise, Isaac, who inherited the promises in addition to inheriting Abraham's estate. And as things go in the course of time, after 20 childless years, Isaac's wife Rebekah gives birth to twins, Esau and Jacob, who have a rocky relationship from the very start. Jacob takes advantage of Esau in a moment of weakness and gets him to sell his birthright to him. Then he also takes advantage of his father's weakness and waits until Esau is away, and then sneaks in, pretends to be Esau, and gets the blessing that belongs to the firstborn, because Isaac is so blind he can't tell the difference anymore. Well, what's the result? Chapter 27, verse 41. "Now Esau hated Jacob because of the blessing with which his father had blessed him. And Esau said to himself, 'The days of mourning for my father are approaching. Then I will kill my brother Jacob.'" Jacob is a trickster and a manipulator, and he's clever enough to get what he wants. He's not very concerned about the morality of his choices. And how did it work out for him? Well, he got the whole birthright thing, and he got the whole blessing thing, but he also got his brother's hatred, and he would end up separated from his brother and from his parents, for all intents and purposes, the rest of his life. Also, not to spoil the story for you, but by the time Isaac dies and the inheritance comes to Jacob, it'll be a drop in the bucket, so what was the point? We could glean a moral from this, that envy and covetousness are never satisfied. Learn to be content, whether you're poor or rich. With all of his problems, and he's got many, God still plans to make use of Jacob. Chapter 28, let's begin in verse 12. And he dreamed, and behold, there was a ladder set up on the earth, and the top of it reached to heaven. And behold, the angels of God were ascending and descending on it. And behold, the Lord stood above it, and said, I am the Lord, the God of Abraham your father, and the God of Isaac. The land on which you lie I will give to you and to your offspring. Your offspring shall be like the dust of the earth, and you shall spread abroad to the west and to the east and to the north and to the south. And in you and your offspring shall all the families of the earth be blessed. Behold, I am with you, and will keep you wherever you go, and will bring you back to this land. For I will not leave you until I have done what I have promised you. At even the most surface level, it's pretty clear that this vision represents a pathway to the presence of God. God is showing him that he is opening that door for Jacob, that he wants to have a continual relationship with him, between God and Jacob. He also reiterates the promises, the same ones that he had given to Abraham and given to Isaac, the promises of this eternal homeland and this nation of descendants through whom the world will be blessed. Chapters 34 through 50 cover Jacob's household as the story continues to progress. His sons grow up, and the story expands then to individual narratives. Jacob's name is changed in chapter 35, verse 10. And God said to him, Your name is Jacob. No longer shall your name be called Jacob, but Israel shall be your name. So he called his name Israel. Full disclosure, that had already happened once, but it's reiterated here. It doesn't seem to have stuck the first time. It doesn't even completely stick the second time, but nevertheless, it's obviously an important shift and a renewal of the covenant. In chapter 37, Joseph's story begins, and you'll probably remember how he was sold into slavery by his own brothers. In chapter 38, Judah's story begins. He is a bit of a deadbeat jerk of a father-in-law. Between the two, Joseph gets far more of the text, but when the family is joined back together between Joseph down in Egypt and the whole rest of the family up in Canaan, well, the leader in practice, if not in name, is no longer Jacob. And it's also not Joseph. The leader has become Judah. Hence, in chapter 49 of Genesis, verse 10, as Jacob gives blessings to his children, he says, The scepter shall not depart from Judah, nor the ruler's staff from between his feet, until tribute comes to him. And to him shall be the obedience of the peoples. And that is both a temporal and an eternal prediction, because it has to do with Judah and Judah's immediate short-term offspring, but also with a descendant of Judah many, many generations down the line, Jesus. Well, the family has to navigate many hardships, and members of this family make quite a few mistakes. Just the ones that are told to us are pretty terrible. They include selling a brother into slavery. We talked about that briefly. They include defrauding their father and continuing to lie to him about what happened to Joseph for in excess of 20 years. They include murdering an entire village in retaliation, and more. But God brings these people through it, and we might ask, why? They're awful. Well, it's because of his plans, not because of their righteousness. And then we find in chapter 49, beginning in verse 29, Then he, that's Jacob, commanded them and said to them, I am to be gathered to my people. Bury me with my fathers in the cave that is in the field of Ephron the Hittite, in the cave that is in the field at Machpelah, to the east of Mamre, in the land of Canaan, which Abraham bought with the field from Ephron the Hittite to possess as a burying place. There they buried Abraham and Sarah his wife, there they buried Isaac and Rebekah his wife, and there I buried Leah. The field and the cave that is in it were bought from the Hittites. When Jacob finished commanding his sons, he drew up his feet into the bed and breathed his last, and was gathered to his people. Well, we've come to the end of the third in line of the patriarchs, but rather than focus on his death there, we might ask, why is he so concerned about where his earthly remains will be buried? What does it really matter? Well, the point is that Egypt, which is where they were at this point, is not home. In fact, there is even a recognition of this in God's prediction back in chapter 46, when Jacob was feeling some trepidation about the idea of relocating to Egypt, leaving the homeland that God had promised to him and his descendants. Chapter 46, verses 1 through 4. So Israel took his journey with all that he had, and came to Beersheba, and offered sacrifices to the God of his father Isaac. And God spoke to Israel in visions of the night, and said, Jacob, Jacob. And he said, Here I am. Then he said, I am God, the God of your father. Do not be afraid to go down to Egypt, for there I will make you into a great nation. I myself will go down with you to Egypt, and I will also bring you up again, and Joseph's hand shall close your eyes. And that forms a nice segue as we wrap all of this up. The story isn't really about Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, Judah, and so forth. In a way, the story is really about those promises. They're the focus. Here are all the times that those promises are explicitly brought up in the text between Abraham and the end of the book of Genesis. That's kind of a lot, isn't it? And note that I said explicitly. This does not include the innumerable allusions or the instances where the promises are taken for granted in the background. Why do they come up so often? We have almost 3 centuries of narrative condensed into just a few pages, and over and over and over these promises came up. Each successive generation gets multiple reiterations and repetitions of the promises because the story isn't about Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph. It's about God's promises. He gives these unlikely promises to these unlikely people, and we see that it is difficult for them to live as if the promises are true. Even if you think and say that you believe him, it's difficult to genuinely believe. The patriarchs all struggled with it. We see flaws in their faith. God doesn't forget, though, and he doesn't change. Once he gives a promise, its fulfillment is absolutely sure. So where do we fit in all this? Well, if we think back to Genesis 12:3, all the families of the earth, remember? Well, that's us, isn't it? From the beginning, we were among the intended recipients of God's blessings. Now, these are realized in Christ, whom Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Judah, and the others foreshadowed. The plan is to redeem you from vain and foolish works to serve the living God forever, free from sin and impurity. And it starts, just like it did with Abraham, with believing that message and obeying God, whether you fully understand or not, which you don't. But even if you once believed and yet you have strayed away and you wish that you could get that back, but it seems to you as if you have lost out on it, what's the problem? God stands ready to receive the wanderer back. He did that for each of the patriarchs over and over. That's also part of the plan. In fact, Jesus distilled this motif into a parable, the parable that we tend to call the prodigal son in Luke 15, beginning in verse 11. I encourage you to check that out after the program is over. Your heavenly Father won't bring you into his house kicking and screaming, but he will watch and wait and remain ready to welcome you. Are you ready to come home? If so, then we would love to help in that reconciliation at River Ridge. You can get in touch with us by phone at 812-550-6234 or send an email to info@riverridgechurch.org. You can also find us at 5600 Van Road in Newburgh for Sunday morning worship at 10. I hope to see you there. Thanks for joining me today on Iron Sharpens Iron.